I hope today that as this day goes along and you begin to kind of prepare your heart and mind for Easter, it's Palm Sunday, as Pastor Mark mentioned. And if you don't know what that is, it's kind of the first week. It's the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. He's hailed as a king, and that's kind of where we are. Today we're going to kind of switch the story a bit, but we're going to start off with a question. How many of you like surprises? Are you a person who likes surprises? No? It's a trick question, right? Because if I said, hey, I have a surprise for everybody in the room, I'm giving everyone a new car, how many of you would like surprises then? How many if I told you it was a Ford, that would kind of change? Never mind. Well, I do have an answer for you. We have a video. I want you to watch this. There are some people who do not like surprises.
I really appreciate it, man.
Yeah.
Alright, guys, so my friend Kyle here, is back from the Marines on the recruiter's assistance, and my other friend is in the garbage can.
Let's admit you should never do that to a person in uniform, okay? That is just such a bad idea from the very... How did they think that was going to go? I don't know. Let's admit that there are different kinds of surprises. I want you to kind of think this through. Matter of fact, I actually got this from a literary site on how to write stories, but then I began to think it through and I went, you know what? There's a lot of truth to life in there. There are some surprises that are this way. They are just out of the blue, right? They're out of the blue. No one knows they're happening. Boom. My son does this to me. I walk in the door and boom. Oh, stop that. One of these days, I'm going to be a Marine. That's what I'm going to do. There's going to be something out of the blue, all right. Anyway, so there's out of the blue surprises. So good or bad, they can be both. The next one often happens in movies or in books, and that's kind of the twist surprise. You think things are going one way, and then there's a turn, something you didn't see coming at all, and you go, that doesn't make sense. Like, the evidence doesn't lead that way. You just surprised us. You didn't give us all the information. We couldn't have figured this out on our own. I don't like that. Now, maybe you like that in movies. The last surprise, as I think, is the best surprise of all, and that's a surprise that's really exceeding your expectations. You know it's your birthday. You know your family's going to do something for you. You're thinking it's going to be a pair of socks, but it's a lot better, right? And you sit there and you go, wow. I didn't expect that much. That's incredible. So I want you to begin to think, which kind of surprise do you like? And that's going to kind of take us in to our discussion today. We're in a series on last Illuminations, the things that Jesus was saying in this last week of his life, from Palm Sunday, which we're celebrating today, all the way to Easter, which we celebrate next week. What was he saying during this time frame to really point out the things that may have been most important in his mind that the disciples needed to hear, and do we still need to hear those today? Now, one of the things that's really in a lot of this section, particularly in Matthew, is there's a couple chapters devoted to a discussion of the end of time. I want to give you a couple phrases that if you hold on to these, it gives you a lot of information that we're going to put some stuff underneath. But these are kind of the basic. If we go through these two chapters in the book of Matthew, these are some of the main points. Here we go. No one knows when, so watch. Hold on to that one. The next one is Jesus has this. It's an invitation to enter into his joy. And we'll explain what that means. And then we go to the book of John. The book of John, it's this one. Don't be troubled. If you've ever sat there and go, man, I'm worried I'm going to, fill in the blank, I'm going to die, or somehow there's going to be this apocalypse and the world's going to come to an end, and you feel very troubled, Jesus has a word for you today. Don't be troubled. Okay? So that's where we're going to go. We're going to start with this idea, first of all, in Christian circles particularly, but even outside of that in movies and things like, there's a lot of interest, at least at times, in the discussion of heaven, a discussion of what happens after I die, a discussion of the end of the world, and a discussion of what does we mean by the last days. That's kind of maybe more of a biblical idea. But all those kind of come up, and occasionally in our fast-paced, just living life, our mind drifts to those. Now, normally it drifts to those when something horrible happens. I hate to admit that. Somebody gets a diagnosis that's not very positive from the doctor. Or we hear some terrible war thing taking place somewhere in the world, and we just think, wow, is this ever going to end? And our mind drifts to the idea or the thought, is there an end? The reality is, as we look in Scripture, here's one of the truths. If we follow what Jesus is saying, if we're a Christ follower, here's what Jesus says. This we know for certain. When we look at all his information about the end, here's what we know for certain. We don't get to make up the ending. Now, even if you're not a Christ follower, but you believe in something after this life, would you at least admit to that? That you don't get to make up the end because you have no control over it. You don't even know what it looks like. So it's not like you're going to make up your mind the way you want this to work, and then the universe is going to kind of bend towards you. Just like you had nothing to do with how you got here. You have no control of the time, the destiny, that where you arrived in this story of God, we are not in control of what happens next. Now, the disciples were very interested in this story as well, or these questions as well. And they begin to ask some questions, and Jesus kind of gets this started in Matthew chapter 23, verse 37 and 39. "O Jerusalem, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" And it's an interesting passage because Jesus has been talking. A couple weeks ago, we talked about the woes he had given to the Pharisees and, doom upon them. And all of a sudden, he breaks into this about Jerusalem and the nation of Israel, that you're not going to see me for a while. And you won't see me again until you say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And this kind of piques the mindset of the disciples. And they begin to ask the question, when is the end? And Jesus had begun to talk about the destruction of the temple. And they begin to ask and bring those two together. And we have that in Matthew chapter 24, the next chapter. He said this, and he sat on the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us when these things will be," speaking of the destruction of the temple, "and what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age?" The disciples had put those two together. In their mind, they couldn't think of a way in which Jesus coming back as the Messiah wasn't connected with the destruction of the temple. Now, Jesus gives information in the following verses of what takes place about 68 AD to about 70 AD in the destruction of the temple. And not one stone will be upon the other, and that's exactly what happens. And Christians there followed some of the words of Jesus at that moment, and they fled the city. He talked about there was things that they were to watch for, wars and famines, but he said none of that's the sign. None of that's the signpost that says we're almost there. He said that's just the beginnings. But he did give several signposts where he would be able to say, that's kind of when you know it's getting closer. And we see that in Matthew chapter 24, verse 14. It says this, "And the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come." In other words, they had this idea that Jesus it's just going to be around the corner. And Jesus says, no, there's this one last signpost that has to happen. That when you see that one, then you know that the end is the next event. So the disciples take him really seriously on this, and they go. Matter of fact, if you read the story of the 12 apostles, including including Paul, where they end up, it is amazing the distance they covered trying to facilitate this command of Jesus, that they would go into all the world as a testimony to all nations. Now, the gospel here, when he says he's going to preach the gospel, proclaim the gospel, that's just the good news of Jesus, that Jesus is making a way to the Father, that there's a way to get connected with God, and it's through him. It's through his sacrifice on a cross that we're going to celebrate on Good Friday, and the life of his resurrection that we're going to celebrate on Sunday. That's the gospel. Not that you have to do it, not that you have to work and earn your salvation or earn your place with God, not that you have to pay a penalty to get there, but that Jesus pays the way for you. And that's going to be proclaimed to the term is ethnos, or every ethnic group. And it's kind of a complex term. It could just be every nation. If Jesus meant every nation, that's probably already happened. In other words, we've already passed that signpost. If he means by that every ethnic group, we're pretty close to that signpost. It's just ahead. So we're not quite sure what's it mean, but here's what we know for certain. It could have already passed us. It already may be in the rearview mirror. What does this tell us? It could be soon. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 36, we get kind of the next idea from Jesus. He says, "But concerning that day and the hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only." So even though Jesus has given us a signpost to go, okay, we just passed that one. We know the next event is his return. But then we get this passage, a perplexing passage, a passage that a lot of people ignore, particularly Christ followers. And they begin to say, oh, he's coming here and he's coming at this time. I have figured it out. And here's what Jesus says, "But concerning the day, the hour, no one knows." And some people say, well, I don't know the exact day. I just know within a couple days. That's not what Jesus is referring to here. Matter of fact, if you read the rest of the passage, it's very clear what Jesus is saying. He says, no one knows the time, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, speaking at least when he was here on this earth, but the Father only. Think about this. He had not given that information to anyone. There's a reason why he has not done so. He goes on in the next verses, and Jesus describes what is going on when he returns. He describes it this way. He said, some are working, some are eating, some are marrying. What's going on when he returns? They are doing life. Life is taking place. No one is sitting out on a hill going, I think it's today. I haven't quit on the world. I haven't quit living. I haven't quit taking the next step of life. But then we get to verse 44, because this is the point. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. In other words, we're going to be living life, doing life, and the only way to be ready is to constantly be ready. You don't get prep time, so to speak. In other words, there's not going to be enough signs. It's not going to be clear enough that you go, you know what, I've got 3 years before I need to worry about it. That's not the point at all, to be ready. When I was a kid, I lived in a place called Pampa, Texas. Now, Pampa, Texas is one of those wonderful places in Texas that about half of the spring, we get tornadoes. And one year, we had 32 tornado warnings in 1 year. It was constant tornado warnings. And one day, we got a tornado warning. And my dad decided he needed to shower. My mom was not happy. Now, the reason why he felt comfortable shower is because there'd been all these other, it's just happening. I mean, it's just another warning. Well, by the time we got in the car to drive to a neighbor's house that had a wonderful storm shelter, it was too late. The tornado was on top of us. We drove next to the house, and we had only time to get inside this brick, fairly stable house as the tornado luckily jumped our city, our little town, and unfortunately hit the town about 3 miles outside of our town. We heard it go over. See, their thought had been, I always will have time. There's always time to get ready. We've got a warning. Here's the truth with the return of Jesus. You're getting your warning now. Today. Be ready. Because when he returns, there will be no prep time. Now that can even affect us in our world today, even but not including the return of Jesus, but even my own life. Many of us will not get prep time before we pass away. Now some of us will. We'll find out that unfortunately we have a bad disease or we're just going to grow old and we know it's coming. But for many, it's just like that. And the reality is you must be ready. Please, today, if you hear nothing else, hear the warning from Jesus. You do not know the time. You do not know the day, the month, the year, the season. You must be ready at all time. The next thing that Jesus goes on to explain in this series of verses is found in Matthew chapter 25, 31 through 32. It says this, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, when he returns to earth, and you're thinking, okay, what does that look like? Here we go. Then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered the nations, and he will separate people from one another as a shepherd separates sheep from the goats. I'm not quite sure what the goats did wrong in ancient Israel, but they get kind of labeled bad. I've been around sheep. They're pretty rough too, but anyway, we'll leave that there. The whole point of this passage is that some are going to be put on his right hand, a place of honor and respect, and some are put on the left, a place of rejection. And while this is a very uncomfortable thought, what we find in this passage that Jesus is very clearly stating is that there is a time of judgment. Now, this is uncomfortable for us in a modern world because here's what we believe. We believe we get to make up the rules. I'm going to tell you honestly, the people that are in this room and the people that we live with in our country, the greatest shock to them when we get to eternity is when we stand before God and realize we're not the rule makers. That we don't get to make up the rules the way we want them. This could be moral, this could be entrance into heaven, it could be a lot of things, but we don't get to make that up. We stand before a judge. His name is Jesus. He created you, and he will actually be your eternal judge. Well, Jesus gives just before this a parable to help understand this moment in Matthew chapter 25, verse 19 and 20. And it's the parable of the talents. Talents not being abilities, talents being a measure usually of silver in the ancient world. Here we go. Now, after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And what had happened, he had given a certain amount of money to 3 different servants, 5, 2, and 1. He comes to the first one. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more. Talents, we think, if we kind of do inflation and living standards, could be up to 5 talents, could be up to around $300,000. A little bit of money. I have brought 5 talents more. Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here, I have made 5 talents. It's interesting, this servant and the next servant who comes, the one with 2, has the same response. He receives and makes 2 more. The interesting thing about them is this: they immediately accept their responsibility given to them and they go into action. They go and they do things. They begin to act. They are not passive. They're not fearful. They begin to realize that this time where the master is away is an important time to prove their service, to show their love for their master, that they care about their master and the responsibility he has given to them. We see this in Matthew chapter 25, verse 21. here's the response of the master when he comes back. This is what we actually want judgment to sound like. His master said to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master." There's several things that we need to grab a hold of this in this discussion about this passage. First of all, when you hear this, you've been given a little, now I will give you much. You begin to think, what's the meaning? Well, the most important part of that meaning is that we begin to apply it to our lives and what Jesus was applying it to judgment. Is that what you and I are doing now, the time frame that we have now, is really represented by receiving 5, 2, or 1. Everyone with a different amount, different abilities, different possibilities. And each one of us now is working. We're in that spot where the master is gone, but we are now working, prepping for the really important time that is later. That this in somehow is not all life that we're ever going to live. Matter of fact, it's only just a breath of life. But the life that comes next is the one that is really real life. He goes on and he describes this moment of eternity by describing it this way. Enter into your master's joy. I don't know what you've ever thought about eternity. When you die or when the Lord returns, if there's an end of time. I don't know if you've ever sat down and thought, what does that look like? What does that mean? But when I was reading this passage and thinking this through again, I thought, what a great way to describe it. Joy. Nearness to the Father, entering into His life-giving joy. If we were to describe our lives today, we would describe it as moments of joy, right? And we have those, don't we? Moments where we go, man, life is good, which is followed by something quite different, usually a nasty surprise. And you go, that's not so good. Matter of fact, that's kind of painful. I wished it weren't like that. I wish that person hadn't taken advantage of me. I wished I hadn't gotten sick. I wish broken, evil life was done. And Jesus invites us into His Father's joy. See, eternal life is this kind of life. Being near God, being close to Him who is the source of all joy. It's where it all comes from. There is another servant who comes. It's the one who only had 1 talent given to him, 1 measure of silver. And here's what happens there. 24 and 25 says this, "And he also who had received the 1 talent came forward saying, 'Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground.' And he gives him the 1 talent back." It's an interesting moment in this judgment moment, once again illustrating our eternal judgment. The servant begins a blame game. It's really your fault that I'm in this predicament, that I've done nothing, because I knew you were such a hard man. There was no way I could possibly please you. You take from others. You can't be trusted. See, the problem with this servant is his heart. Now, instead of defending himself, the master actually uses the man's own words against him. He basically says this. He says, if you were so inclined, you should have acted. We find this in 25 verse 30. He says, "Cast the worthless servant out into outer darkness, in that place where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth." The whole idea here, Jesus says, is if you believe me to be such a hard man, it should have motivated you to act It should have motivated you to get moving, at least out of fear, if not out of love. And in response, the Bible says that he is, quote, cast out to a place of darkness, a place of sorrow, a place of anger. Everything that is opposite of joy. And maybe we've never thought about eternity in those kind of extremes or those kind of pictures of a place of absolute joy and a place of gnashing teeth, of anger, of hatred. But that's how Jesus describes it in this moment. And it's a heart issue with this servant, a servant who doesn't love his master. He views him in a very negative light. In Matthew chapter 25, verse 41 and 42, Jesus goes down on the next series of talks in the book, and he continues this theme on, and it's a couple chapters long, so we're going to pull one little piece out of it just to kind of get the picture. In Matthew chapter 25, it says this, "Then he will say to those on his left," those would be the goats, what does he say? "Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food." Now, normally we look at that and we go, oh man, and we see the burning part. What we miss is the "depart from me." And actually, in that whole passage, it's on the screen that you read, the "depart from me" is actually the most important part, the most painful part. See, everything else, the darkness that Jesus has already described, the absence of joy, the suffering, hell itself, is really because of being distant from God, who is the source of all life. I'll just ask you this question. Did you create your life? No. Did you create the life on this globe or this planet? No. Matter of fact, we don't know how to do that. But yet here it is, as the source of His creation, a earth that we get to enjoy. But in eternity, there's a choice made to be with Him because we love Him, or to be departed from Him because we don't. See, if they would have loved Jesus, this passage reveals that they would have done kind things. And that's the whole point of this passage. They ask, when did we not take care of you? When did we not love you? When did we not give something to you? And he basically says, well, when you ignored everyone around you. When you didn't care for others. But if we'd have known it was you, we'd have done it. I know. That's the reason you don't know that. That's the reason I didn't tell you. Because I wanted to know your heart. A person who really loves Jesus, that will come out around them in the way they live. And it begs the question, in a modern society, do we really believe in eternal judgment? Do we really believe in something like eternity apart from God, this thing called hell? And I just ask you a question. Have you ever uttered the words, why doesn't God do something about, fill in the blank, about this evil, this brokenness? Why did God let that person get sick? Why did God let that person die early? Why did God let that leader rise up and destroy a nation and kill hundreds and hundreds of thousands of other people? Why does God let this stuff happen? If you've ever said those words, you believe in eternity apart from God as well as with God. Because there's something deep within you going, this is not the way it ought to be, and God is the one to solve it, and He does in eternity. He separates those, one on His right, that want to be with Him and love Him and one another, and those that would prefer to be apart from God and live completely on their own without His love. Chapter 25, verse 34, there's this wonderful promise. It says, then the king will say to those on his right, still judgment, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. It goes back to the idea where Jesus talks about that he's preparing a place. We're going to get there in a second. I want to wrap these two together. I want you to think this through with me, that Jesus has been preparing for a really long time for you personally. If you are a follower of him, he has been preparing for you. What kind of surprise is that going to be? It's going to be one that exceeds expectations. If you could take right now and just kind of think, you know what, I would really like this in eternity. Well, not even close. Not even close to the joy and the peace that you will experience with your Creator and his Son Jesus. Well, all this can be a little unsettling. It is for me. I have friends that are not following, that I'm not sure where they would be at this moment. But Jesus comes back and gives us these words in John chapter 14. We're skipping over to John now. Once again, the same time frame in the last week of his life. He says these words, "Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you." The idea here is it can actually be in God's family. There's many dwelling places. There's very many opportunities to belong. And he gives a human illustration of a building. And in this moment, it kind of helps us connect even what happens when I die, what's happened to all the people who have died in faith up to now, and even still brings in this whole idea of eternity. What has he been doing? Well, that's what he said he was doing. He was going to prepare this special place for us. This is supposed to bring us comfort. No matter where you are in your life, it's only a few short years before you will face eternity. I know it's an uncomfortable thought because we don't like to talk about death in our world. We'd rather put it way out there in no man's land. Well, no man's land tends to creep closer and get closer and closer. And here's the beautiful part about this, is Jesus is not writing a twist ending. He wanted us to know. He didn't come out of the blue with just surprise, no prep, you have no chance. He didn't want a twist ending so that at the end you're going, but you told us it was this way. You led us to believe this, but it was really way over here. I had no chance. Jesus is not going to do that. What he's actually doing is preparing a surprise beyond our expectation, beyond what you can imagine in your best dream, what eternity will be like. Well, it raises the question, what's our part? What do I do? I actually want to make sure I make it. I hope you do too. What's our part? Well, the ones we've already talked about, the words that came up early in Matthew, to watch. But what does watch mean? Watch does not mean go sit out on a hill, sell my goods, give it away to the church or something and stand up and wait. Matter of fact, it means just the opposite. I am to continue to live life, to work, to love, to do the things I'm supposed to do with my kids, my family, my friends, my job. But I'm supposed to do it with the end in mind. Does that make sense? I'm not just getting up and doing work. I'm not just loving my wife. I'm not just going to church. I'm living constantly with there's an end coming. There is a moment of judgment. God is going to see my actions and the way I treat you, the way I treat my wife, the way I work, whether I'm lazy and hide and steal time from my employer. All of that is going to be seen. And I will give an account for everything I do. That is living watchfully. That's what he means. Watch. Keep that thought in mind. Don't become so focused on security here. Once again, we're living life, but with the end in mind. The next thing that kind of comes out in all these verses that we need to do is love God. See, the problem with the servant who was departed was he did not love God. He hadn't spent enough time with the master. He hadn't connected with the master in a way that he knew his master. He had horrible perception of who he was, a master who takes. That is not the God of this universe who gives, abundantly gives. In so doing, when we love God, we will then show our love for others. This is what we need to be doing. Some of that is sharing the gospel, as was required of the disciples, but also sharing his love, just letting God's love be known. Maybe that comes through in physical things and kindness. Maybe it comes through following through with your ministry and what God's asked you to do on this planet. We're going to talk a lot more about that after Easter. But just doing life, loving God, and loving others. This takes us to one more passage in John chapter 14, where Jesus says this. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. See, this is kind of the be comforted through these words, and then he says these words, I am the way, the truth, and life. That phrase is really answering the question, how do we get to eternity with God? And Jesus answers this way, I am the way. This is true what I'm telling you. Jesus saying, look, I know there's a lot of thoughts about what this looks like, but I am the truth. And when you get there, you will find out I am the life. This is where you will find eternal life. Begin with, it says here, believe. He started that whole passage off with believe in God, believe also in me. Paul says it this way. He says, remain in the faith. In other words, stay steadfast in belief that Jesus is the truth, the life, and the way. See, it's not about just kind of being good or somehow my good outweighs my bad and that'll be good enough. None of that's how I enter into eternity with God. I enter into eternity by trusting His very goodness and then living that goodness out. Well, what step can we take this morning? We're going to be participating in communion. And it's going to be a part of wrapping this kind of idea of what can I do now? I want to ask you a question this morning. In your life presently, what is distracting you from watching for the return of Christ? What's keeping you from that? It's very easy in our world to be distracted, to get so caught up in today and the challenges of today and the life that we're supposed to be living. It's so easy to lose the track that I am living for eternity, that there's an eternal life. I want to challenge you this morning. Is there anything that's distracting you from that? If there is, you need to confess that. And that needs to change. You need to bring that before God, even as we're doing communion, and you need to go, okay, God, I don't want to let anything long-term get in the way. So whatever I need to do, I'm willing to do. Philippians chapter 1, verse 9. Paul goes on to talk about it this way. He talks about that we're going to pray. He actually prays for those that they would remain in faith. This morning as we're taking communion, if you're going, you know what, I think I'm in a pretty good spot, then I want to encourage you to pray for others. Pray for others. As we head towards communion, there was the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 26, and where he talks about, as he was passing out communion, the first supper, Lord's Supper, with his disciples, he actually says this, I'm not going to eat this again until I eat it with you in the new kingdom. So today, communion is actually an act of remembering. Going back and remembering the last meal that the disciples had with Jesus. And him saying, look, I'm not going to eat this again until I eat with you in eternity. And you think, I didn't know that we were eating in eternity. Well, there's a lot that's the Bible kind of hints at. It's a very human existence long term. But it raises the question for us this morning, and communion will be a part of answering this question. Do you want to live with God eternally? Is that what you want? Does the sound of that go, you know what, singing all the time? You don't have a very good concept of eternity. No, it's going to be a lot more joy than that. Floating around in heaven with angels' wings, you got all messed up. It's not eternity. It is being with God forever. Intimate, close, experiencing His joy, being human in the middle of all that. Do you want to love Him, be with Him for all eternity? Because in some ways, the next meal that we eat is with Him as we celebrate this today. The worship team's going to play a song, kind of lead us into an idea of eternity. I want you just to begin to kind of remove the distractions for a moment. If you're already thinking about what you got to do this afternoon, please don't. Take this moment. It'll be there when you get done. Think about life. How many more years do you have? How many more opportunities do you hear this warning to be ready? I don't know. I don't know how many any of us have. I sure don't know how many I have. But today is an invitation to come and remember what He did for us. When He took the bread and He blessed the bread. He said, "This is my body which is broken for you. Eat this in remembrance of me." It was a symbol of His sacrifice, of His life that He would give on the cross. He goes on and He says, "And take this cup and drink this cup. It is the new covenant. It's the new agreement between me and humanity that follows me." The new cup is a cup of life that comes from Him, His sacrifice for our life. And if you want to participate in that life once again, I encourage you to come. As the song is going on, you can take communion at your speed, the way you want. You have the whole song, there's no rush. If you're new to Journey, if you are a Christ follower, you're more than free, welcome to come and partake. Even if you're at a spot where you're going, I'm not sure where I am, but you want to take that first step with Jesus, let this be your first step. Saying, God, I want to know you. I want to understand your love and your grace. Forgive me, and come and partake communion.